we're delighted to be taking part in the Bússola Tech series. To begin with, I would like to introduce the team that worked on this piece of research. My name is Catherine McCarthy. I'm an administrative officer on the digital transformation team in the Irish Parliament, which is known as the Oireachtas. BTV0000061, who worked on the first phase of the research with me, is an administrative officer in the committee secretariat. Thomas Efe is a junior clerk in the committee secretariat, and Thomas will be presenting with me this afternoon. And also Sarah O'Farrell was a member of our team, and she is a clerk in the committee secretariat as well. So we're looking forward to sharing our research with you this afternoon, and we hope you find it useful and insightful. The research project was divided into two phases, both of which have been completed, and we'll be talking to you today about both of those phases. So just to give a little bit of background and give you an idea of the structure of the presentation. So I'm going to give a little bit of background and context and go through a summary of our literature review. Tom will take you through the methodology and objectives and our ranking system and analysis. Tom will also talk through some of the key findings on organizational structure, and I will talk through some of the findings around knowledge management. Tom will then be talking you through some of the limitations of the research, and I will conclude with just a few round of conclusions. So just to give some background and some context, in 2020, as part of the digital transformation in the Irish Parliament, or as it's known, the Oireachtas, a digital parliament research team, initially consisting of myself and BTV0000061, was established to examine how other parliaments have carried out digital transformation and to see what lessons can be learned from the experiences of digital transformation in other countries. So the first phase of the research was an examination of parliamentary websites, and a benchmarking and ranking exercise was also carried out to measure the level of digital sophistication of parliaments across the world. Ireland actually did relatively well in this first phase of the research in looking at the Oireachtas website. It ranked 8 out of 20 parliamentary websites that were examined, and it scored well in areas such as broadcasting, members' information, information on committees, and visits to Parliament. So the findings of phase 1 were presented to senior management in the Oireachtas in May 2020. And a research paper was produced by myself and BTV0000061, and that was published on the Oireachtas internal website in July 2020. And then in October 2020, myself, Thomas Efe, and Sarah O'Farrell concluded phase 2 of the research project. And this phase involved carrying out semi-structured interviews with staff, both in the Oireachtas and in external parliaments. These semi-structured interviews focused on priority areas that were highlighted in phase 1, mainly organizational structure and knowledge management. So I suppose just to highlight at this stage that this was not the first attempt at digital transformation in the Oireachtas. Previous projects were planned and presented to senior management, but were dropped or stalled due to a lack of ownership or lack of buy-in by staff and senior management. For example, we had, there was a people, organisation and development report that was produced that had recommendations in it that were only partially implemented. There was also an information management system launched, I think, in 2012, and was relaunched several times since. And the feedback received on those projects from staff and management all raised issues regarding organizational structure and knowledge management, and that any work that was done to improve digital transformation should focus on these areas. And our research highlighted that other parliaments had had similar experiences with failed or stalled digital transformation projects. There was examples from the Hungarian Parliament and also from the New Zealand Parliament. So as part of our research, we carried out 5 interviews with staff from within the Oireachtas across a number of different departments, and 14 interviews, which covered 11 parliaments, with staff from those external parliaments. So Tom will be explaining a little bit more about the methodology of this phase a little bit later in the presentation. So the research paper also included a literature review, which examined theories and trends in organizational structure and knowledge management, particularly in the public sector, from the early 20th century to the present day. So just to give a very quick summary of this literature review. So under organizational structure, we looked at the area of organizational theory and how this topic has changed over time, moving from a Weberian view of organization, which was quite hierarchical with well-defined roles, and moving on to take into account other factors such as culture and external factors. We were particularly interested in trends in organizational structure in the public sector and the whole debate around the difference between organizational structure in the private sector versus the public sector. We were surprised a little bit to note that there is a bit of a gap in the research regarding the application of organizational theory to parliaments. So the literature tends to focus on the executive branches of government, like government departments and agencies, as opposed to the legislature, even though this, despite legislature being a key pillar of state. We did note that the Oireachtas stands out a little bit in this area. There has been some academic focus on the Oireachtas. There's a book has been published, Houses of the Oireachtas, Parliament in Ireland, and there's been several academic papers written. So we hope that our research will go some way to filling this gap in the research. And then briefly, just to talk about the area of knowledge management. So we looked at, in particular, looking at questions such as how knowledge can be defined, the difference between tacit and explicit knowledge, how tacit knowledge can be shared, how explicit knowledge can be shared, and how tacit knowledge can be converted to explicit knowledge and vice versa. So parliaments in particular have a high volume of tacit knowledge, especially in procedural units. So we were looking to see how can this asset be utilised by the organisation. We also looked at knowledge management systems. These are ways in which organisations can use the asset of knowledge held by staff. However, we did again notice a gap in the research. Although a lot of parliaments utilised knowledge management systems and utilised in particular IT solutions, there was very little academic research done on the intersection between knowledge management systems and IT. So again, we hope that our research will go a little way to filling that gap. So I'll hand over to Tom now, who will talk about the methodology and objectives of our research.
So the objectives of this phase of the research project are to provide an evidence base for digital transformation in the Houses of the Oireachtas and to rank the performance of all the parliaments, including the Oireachtas, in the priority areas. So we chose semi-structured interviews as the best method to collect the evidence for this research. This gave us the foundation of working with a set group of questions, but also the flexibility of expanding on answers throughout the interviews. So interviews began in June and finished up in September of 2020. And we interviewed not only English-speaking parliaments, but also Brazil, Hungary, Estonia, and Sweden. Staff from plenary, procedural, and ICT units were focused on in these interviews as units most bound together by and linked with digital transformation. The full details of all the interviews carried out, literature review, and analysis of the findings are set out in the second research paper. So now to talk a little bit about the ranking system. As the interviews were carried out focusing on the two sections of knowledge management and organizational structure, that's how we decided to divide the ranking system. The focus on both arose from the first phase of the research project. We compiled a list of 34 ranking factors, which came about from undertaking the interviews. We used these to rank the Parliament's performances. Some examples of ranking factors from organizational structure are regular meetings for all staff and collaboration within and between units. And if we just take a look at the factors for knowledge management, some examples are accessible knowledge databases and team days or workshops. So it is a non-weighted system. Scores of 1 were allocated where evidence was shown of a factor in an interview, 0 for no evidence of a factor. There was also a list of 14 barriers to successful digital transformation compiled. A score of -1 was allotted where evidence of a barrier was highlighted. A top score of 34 was possible if a parliament had all factors present and no barriers. So as previously noted, we developed the barriers to success through thematic analysis of the research paper. It is important to note that in designating a factor as a barrier to success, we are not making a value judgment about it. These are factors that hinder digital transformation but that is not to say that they are things that can be or even should be changed. For example, a fear of reputational loss and aversion to risk are both part and parcel of procedural units where the outcome of work is highly public. Some barriers to success are in fact assets to an organisation, such as the high volumes of tacit knowledge. Barriers to success must be worked around and taken into consideration, and we found the parliaments that ranked highest were those that most effectively mitigated those barriers to success. So now to hand back to Catherine, who will talk about the ranking of the parliaments.
So we were looking, obviously in doing our research, we looked at it very much from the point of view of the Oireachtas. So the key question of where Ireland ranks against other parliaments, you can see overall out of the 12 parliaments, including the Oireachtas, Sweden ranked first and Ireland 12th. And this is the ranking for both organisational structure and knowledge management. And we can see that the top 6 countries there are very closely packed together. There's very little difference between the countries. And now if we look into the ranking for organisational structure, we can see that Sweden, Hungary and Canada all share the top ranking there, with Ireland ranking 12th. And if we look at this ranking, we can see that there's a bit of a division between the bottom 3 countries, so Ireland, Brazil and Northern Ireland, and the remaining 9 countries, which have very little difference in between them. So the factors that pushed the top 5 countries up the rankings were ranking factors such as buy-in of senior management, the existing of a paperless culture, the establishment of an ongoing review process, and the application of project management methodologies. And these top 5 countries also scored fewer barriers to success than the middle and bottom ranking countries. So if we have a look next at the ranking for knowledge management, we can see that Australia is ranked first, Ireland is second last there, and along with Wales, and Northern Ireland is last. So like the ranking for organisational structure, there's a bit of a divide between the countries. So you can see the division between the bottom 7, Northern Ireland, Ireland, Wales, New Zealand, Hungary, Brazil and Estonia, and the top 5, Sweden, Canada, Scotland, the European Parliament and Australia. And again, the countries that ranked in the top 5 were allotted scores for things such as searchable knowledge databases, designated staff to maintain knowledge databases, work families or understudy systems in place, and staff mobility and rotation. So in looking closer at the ranking for Ireland, we can see that under organisational structure, Ireland achieved a score for a number of the ranking factors. So things like regular meetings for all staff, regular meetings for staff of certain grades. We found a lot of evidence for very high level of collegiality and informal communication, which was seen as one of the essential factors in digital transformation. Co-location and open plan seating, although in COVID-19 times, this factor is somewhat mute. Bottom-up staff buy-in, remote capability, the use of digital transformation to add value and transform organisational structure, the application of project management methodologies, and a well-developed internal communications. And then if we look at the findings for knowledge management, we can see again that the Oireachtas scored for quite a number of the ranking factors, clear role descriptions. There was evidence of documentation of tasks, processes and procedures. There was the existence of accessible knowledge databases, shadowing and on-the-job training, subject matter experts. There was quite a bit of evidence for staff working groups and steering committees, for staff mobility and rotation. Quite a high level of management and soft skills training, and high availability of staff training in general. So we can see that what pushes Ireland down the ranking is the presence of the barriers to success. And as Tom was explaining, these are factors that can hinder digital transformation, but can't necessarily be changed. They're just part and parcel of working closely to the political arena. However, parliaments that have been placed high in the rankings have managed to come up with strategies to work around these barriers. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail about these strategies a little later on in the presentation. It's important as well, I think, probably to point out that we had to bear in mind a few other factors when we were carrying out these rankings. So firstly, there's always a level of difficulty in comparing parliaments. The structure of parliaments varies, the age makeup of staff, size and availability of resources all vary and they all play a part. For example, if you take parliaments such as Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, these are young and devolved parliaments with a different structure and a different age makeup of staff. Whereas if you look at the larger countries such as Hungary, Sweden, Australia, Brazil, the European Parliament, these are many times bigger than Ireland, and they have more resources, both in terms of money and people at their disposal. So I'm just going to hand over to Tom just to talk through some of the barriers to success and the strategies employed by other parliaments to overcome these barriers. So Tom is going to talk about the organizational structure side of things.
So if we look into the barriers to success in more detail, we can see how staff attempted to come up with strategies to overcome these barriers. Let's take some of these barriers to success as an example. So resistance to change. The biggest challenge we saw in rolling out digital transformation is staff attitudes and mindset to new processes and programs. This shows the importance of change management when rolling out digital transformation and ensuring staff are comfortable with both the content of change and the process of change. Staff buy-in, both bottom up and top down from senior management, are seen as a key to successful implementation of digital transformation. Risk-adverse culture or fear of reputational loss. As mentioned previously, there's a lot of fear and nervousness around changing, digitizing processes and systems with the chamber. This is an aspect of dealing with the political sphere and having highly visible outputs that must be taken into account in digital transformation. For example, staff must be very comfortable with any new systems or processes in the chamber, and they should not go live until they have been thoroughly tested and staff are trained and comfortable. Interestingly, the COVID-19 pandemic has overridden some of this fear in many parliaments, and new systems such as e-voting have been rolled out to react to this crisis. This, of course, is an exceptional circumstance. High administrative workload. The biggest benefit of transformation seen in parliaments is that it allows staff to focus on value-added tasks and reduces admin workload. For example, a unit in the European Parliament that used to be responsible for printing has pivoted to focus on digital publishing and data. When the old tasks were rendered obsolete by digital processes, this unit found a way to offer new value-added services to the citizen. This process of reassigning staff and adding value also helps build staff buy-in, as staff see that they need not fear being made redundant when their admin workload is reduced by digital transformation. And Catherine will talk about a little bit more about barriers to success for knowledge management.
So just to have a look in a little bit more detail about the barriers to success under knowledge management. And if we just take, I'll just take a few of these and go into them in a bit of detail. So if we take high volumes of tacit knowledge, so all the parliaments that we interviewed demonstrated quite a high volume of tacit knowledge, and quite a collegiate atmosphere within teams was seen as being very important to effectively share and use this knowledge asset. So people can share information by asking those around them or through informal contact, so such as coffee breaks, chats in the corridor. And then in a COVID-19 world, we found that this was replicated to some extent by using applications such as MS Teams, which allows people to communicate informally by just jumping on calls and sending instant messages. Another way of sharing tacit knowledge that we came across during these interviews was matching the skills and interests of staff to the work that they do. So we didn't come across a huge amount of evidence of formal career development strategies, but what we did see was informal career development processes. So managers spoke informally to their staff about their interests and their career goals and made sure that any relevant opportunities were sent their way. And then if we have a look then at over-reliance, so almost all the parliaments demonstrated a reliance on a few highly experienced staff, particularly in the plenary and procedural units. The level of reliance varied across parliaments. In order to mitigate against this, some parliaments operated an understudy approach to staff training. So staff are trained in the work of their colleagues and they can fill in for them in the case of annual leave or illness. In other parliaments, they had a larger kind of a work family groups where 3 or more staff could cover for each other. So much like documentation, this process or this approach requires additional time for staff to train up on the work of their colleagues as well as their own tasks. And in many parliaments, staff who had moved on to other units in the organisation were often called on to return to procedural units to provide cover when needed. And we definitely saw this in our own parliament in the Oireachtas. So finally, looking at documenting. So the challenge of capturing and documenting accumulated knowledge in people's heads was an issue that was raised in each interview with the staff that we talked to. Canada and Scotland stood out as having particularly good strategies for this. So Canada had quite a sophisticated knowledge management system, and they used MS Notes that all staff had access to, and all staff went in and they updated as they went with procedural changes, decisions, or interesting lessons that they had learned. And that fed into the overall knowledge management system, which was accessible and searchable. In Scotland, they had a wiki notes system. So all staff had wiki notes that they added to, and these were cross-referenced and searchable and available to all staff. So I'll now hand back over to Tom, who will go through some of the observations and limitations of the research.
So semi-structured interviews worked best with the English-speaking parliaments. It was easier to build a rapport and to expand on answers given throughout. It posed certain difficulties, however, with less fluent English speakers participating in the interviews. At times, it was difficult to know if interviewees fully understood questions, if they understood but did not have the fluency to expand, or if they just had nothing more to add. The research team was aware that there was a conscious bias towards parliaments in Western European countries with similar parliamentary structures. This bias could be due to a history of contact and ease of communications between our parliaments. We managed to get 11 out of the 20 parliaments who had featured in the first phase of the research to agree to an interview, which we considered to be a good sample size. It should be noted that the parliaments who agreed to an interview tended to score best in the first phase of the research. Of the parliaments we could not interview, various reasons were given for not participating, such as the COVID pandemic or the summer parliamentary recess. The ranking factors, barriers to success, and the scores allotted came from the research data. The transcripts of the interviews were reviewed by the research team several times, and scores allotted to each parliament were reviewed and discussed extensively by the team. And now to hand back to Catherine to conclude.
So just to wrap up with a few quick conclusions. So this research is a snapshot in time. The parliaments that were interviewed will continue to progress and develop. They won't stand still. Our findings are qualitative. They do give a detailed picture of performance in relation to digital transformation, and they are very much based on our interpretation of the information that was gathered in the interviews. The areas of achievement and improvement are clearly set out, and it gives the Oireachtas and indeed other parliaments the opportunity to learn from the experiences that we've laid out in the report, and also further work is needed, particularly in the Oireachtas on those priority areas in order for us to keep pace with the level of development that's occurring in other parliaments, and also to advance our own digital transformation strategy. So I'd like to thank you for giving us the time to talk to you today, and we hope that you find the research useful and insightful. Thank you very much.